Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. It is great to have everyone here. And I have as my guest today, Jordan Reason to Doubt. Welcome, Jordan.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jordan, jumping right in, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and about your channel?
Sure. By training, I'm a mechanical and nuclear engineer, and might be surprising to some people to learn that I used to be a young Earth creationist. So I believed the Earth was 6,000 years old, and consumed a lot of Ken Ham and Ken Hovind stuff when I was growing up, and that was pretty much where it stood until I was a young adult, and someone handed me a book and showed me that I was wrong. So the channel is focused on skepticism, and I run it with a friend of mine, Jared, who is a former theologian. We're both atheists. And the goal is really to promote skepticism and kind of be the person I wish I had, 10, 15 years ago, to teach me how to think better about things, and to just promote better skepticism.
You might be exactly the kind of person I'm looking for something else.
Well, I'm at your service.
Well, unfortunately, you can't actually help me with this, I don't believe, because the problem that I'm having right now, and I posted this on Twitter and asked for some suggestions and didn't really get any that were very good, is when I play a video game, I want the platinum trophy. And if it is at all possible, I will get the platinum trophy. And I'm very close to the platinum trophy in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. The one thing that
Good
is
game.
driving me absolutely nuts is the cairns. There's 4 of them that I don't have. You have to stack the stones so they don't fall over.
Yep.
And there's 4 of them that I cannot get.
I don't know if I got them all, but I definitely enjoyed that mini game. Valhalla was fun. Yeah.
If there's one cheat that I would want, it would be for the cairns.
Yeah. It was kind of funny. Just like my wife went by, and like sometimes I'm this big Viking guy kicking in doors and throwing axes, and then 5 minutes later I'm like carefully stacking rocks.
Well, I'm a female Eivor. And occasionally that works out just a tad oddly. There's a bit of the dialogue that doesn't work quite right, but for the most part, it's kind of fun being a female Eivor. Okay, getting back to our topic for the evening, I asked Jordan to talk about 2 issues. One is how he came to his skepticism, and I'm especially interested in what book it was that broke young Earth for you. So I'll let you take over that portion of the discussion for now.
Yeah. So, like I said, I was raised in young Earth creationism until I was well into adulthood. I was probably 22 or 23 at this point. And I was talking about it with a coworker of mine. I wish I remembered this coworker's name because he was extremely influential in my life, but I don't remember who it was. But I do remember the book. The book was The Language of God by Francis Collins. And what that book really did for me was arm me with better questions and the tools to answer those questions. So I was always very inquisitive growing up, and I would hear things from like Answers in Genesis about how the second law of thermodynamics disprove evolution or whatever. And I would say, that seems weird because it's like a really fundamental thing. How have scientists not thought of this? But it then I just didn't know where to go to get that answer, So, or if I went somewhere, it would be to Answers in Genesis or ICR or something, and they'd give me an answer. So once I started reading Dr. Collins' book, it was like all of these things that I was told were unanswerable, and that there weren't answers, but there were answers right here, And so that just sparked me asking more questions, which then led to more answers, and that ultimately ended with me as an atheist. Though it is ironic that the journey was started by Francis Collins, who is a Christian and was writing the book specifically to teach Christians that evolution and religion can coexist. Didn't end up that way.
We have a question from Henry M. Francis Collins, with the dude from the Genome Project.
Yep, that's the guy. He wrote that book. I actually don't know if he's written other books. It's the only book I've read from him. That was just like the starting point, and from there, it was kind of like a fighting retreat from Christianity for me. So like I realized that young Earth creationism wasn't tenable. So I was like, okay, well, I guess the Earth is old, but maybe God still did special creation. Then I kept reading more. It's like, okay, I guess that doesn't work. Maybe now I'm an old Earth creationist, and it was like, well, that's not necessary either. And it just kept going further and further back until eventually there was just no room left.
How old were you when you stopped believing in young Earth?
Um, I think I was around 24.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you'd probably just recently graduated from college?
Actually, no. I didn't graduate college until a few years back
Okay.
because I was originally going to college at in Virginia, but my wife at the time got pregnant, so I had to take care of kids. So it took me 10 years or something like that. It took a very long time for me to get my degree. With, a lot of night school and stuff.
Okay. So you were still a student at the time?
Yeah, at that time I had I was kind of taking like one or two classes, and it's possible that I would have run into a similar breaking point later on in my schooling career. I don't know. I hope so. But, but who can say? Yeah.
We have a comment here that says, "Hey Granny in chat, hey Jordan, first I've heard of your channel, but have a subscribe." So
Thank
looks
you
like you've
kindly.
got one new subscriber. And that is one of the goals of this show, is to get some more subscribers for Jordan and to promote some of the newer channels. I can't remember. Did we mention how long you've have your had your channel, or was that before we started the show?
That was before. So
Okay.
technically, the channel itself is like 2 years old, but we started as a podcast, and we're kind of like just like throwing our audio on YouTube and not really doing much with it.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't really start like focusing on YouTube until the beginning of the year. So I guess it's been about 10 months now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Johnny says you now have another subscriber.
Thank you very much. Like I said, we focus on skepticism. So we do some religious stuff. Like we have a video coming out soon on like answering questions for atheists. We're going to talk
Mm,
mythicism next month. We've got
mhm.
David Fitzgerald coming on, so we're going to try to hold his feet to the fire. But we also like just tackled essential oils and other woo woo nonsense. So
Have you ever had Godless Engineer on?
he hasn't been on our channel. I've been on his.
Okay.
I went on his to talk about mythicism, which is a really fun conversation. And then he was kind enough to invite me to a panel on mythicism again, which it turned out I was the only non-mythicist on the panel.
Mm,
It was like 4-on-1, but it was a really
mhm,
nice time anyway.
mm, okay. Yeah, I know that he's a mythicist. That's why he was the first one I thought of when you mentioned that.
Mhm.
Um, One of the mods, if you don't mind, the link to Jordan's channel is in the description, and if one of you could copy that and post it in the chat, that would be helpful. I'd appreciate that. Question for you: do you have much on nuclear physics?
We do have a couple videos, mainly addressing young Earth creationism in the context of nuclear physics. So
Mhm.
um, some creationist models require accelerated nuclear decay, which doesn't work because it would turn the Earth into a superheated ball of radioactive death. And so I have a couple videos explaining why the heat problem exists and the exact magnitude of that problem. We also did a video on nuclear reactors, kind of in general, in the context of Russia's attack on Ukraine, and they were threatening a nuclear reactor. So basically, the point of that video is it is bad, but maybe not as catastrophically bad as some people are imagining.
Mhm,
So I
mhm.
went through like how a nuclear reactor actually works and like what it would really look like if it was, hit with a bomb or something.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that was what I was about to ask you about. Even though that's, slightly off topic from the show, but it's certainly relevant to your field. What's going on in Ukraine?
Yeah. So in terms of like the nuclear reactors, I can talk about that if you want me to. I mean, I will literally talk nuclear power all night if someone gives me the excuse. So, um, but basically, the danger when there's a war going on with a nuclear power plant is probably the most serious danger is that they'll lose power at the power plant, which seems weird, right? Like yeah, pesky little heat, just a little heat problem. I mean, they would just like vaporize the crust, no big deal. Uh, uh, but yeah, that it seems weird that losing power to a nuclear power plant would be a problem. But because of you can't just turn off a nuclear reactor and just walk away. You have to keep it cool,
Mhm.
and those systems that keep it cool require electricity. And so if you lose power to the station, it's only a matter of time before rods start melting. So that
Mm.
I think is the most dangerous likely thing to happen is the grid would go down, they'd have to shut down the reactor, and then it's just a matter of time.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, the heat problem for young earthers is something that was introduced to me by Erica Gutsick-Gibbon.
Mhm.
I've watched a couple of her videos on the heat problem because the first time I heard it, I said, that's interesting. And the second time I heard it, I said, that's not only interesting, that's really a complete defeater, but I don't think that I could explain that. And so I've had to watch it like 4 or 5 times because science is not my field. So some of these I have to watch several times to pick up the vocabulary and be able to actually explain the arguments.
Yeah, and the heat problem actually, there's two separate heat problems depending on what model you're talking about. You've got the radioactive decay problem that I usually talk about because that's more of where my specialty lies. But you've also got in certain models like catastrophic plate tectonics, the fact that these plates are rushing across the Earth's surface, at race car speeds, and that generates a lot of heat as well. I haven't done calculations to see how much heat, but for the rough calculations I've seen out there indicates probably not as much as the radioactive decay, but still plenty to like boil the oceans and
Mhm, mhm. We also have a question from Henry. Does nuclear physics also discuss various dating methods?
So if the question is, do my videos in nuclear physics talk about that? I do have a video or two on like radiometric dating and how it works and answering some of the young Earth creationist objections. And if people are interested in more of that, I'll talk about this all day. Radiometric dating is not nuclear physics per se. Like it
Okay.
uses nuclear physics to do things, right? So the field that really does radiometric dating, I think it's called radiogeology, and I am not a radiogeologist, so I understand more of like the theory behind it. I'm also not a nuclear physicist, but the physics behind radiometric dating is not that complicated. So I understand that level of physics. And when I have to get into like the nitty gritty of like how they prepare lab samples and stuff like that, I go to a geologist to get that stuff.
Okay. Um, the radioactive dating is one of the things that was convincing to me that evolution did not exist way back when I was a teenager. And it was from some of the chick tracks. Are you familiar with chick tracks?
Oh
Okay.
yeah.
And one of the arguments that was made in one of the chick tracks was that carbon 14 dating is so inaccurate because they did testing on a live mollusk, and the test showed that the mollusk was like 10,000 years old. And I bought that hook, line, and sinker before I had someone explain to me the limitations of what radioactive dating can and cannot do.
Yeah, the best lies come with some truth, and I mean that is a true thing that happened. They tested a mollusk, and it did come with an erroneously large age. And ironically, the paper they usually cite is the paper where they're saying, "Hey, look at this limitation of radiocarbon dating. Don't use it for this," because of the reservoir effect. Because mollusks aren't getting their carbon from the atmospheric air, so it just violates one of the assumptions of the model. No big deal. So that's something that I find ironic in young Earth creationists. They will, with one breath, say that every physicist and geologist and all of these researchers are liars, and they're just like motivated and biased. And then in the exact other breath, and that like the very next sentence, they'll talk about how they'll cite papers, which they just told us we shouldn't believe anyway. But then they'll say things like, well, this method, should be perfect. They ignore the fact that all methods have limits.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
You try to explain to them, hey, maybe a method that's useful on rocks that are a billion years old, maybe you shouldn't use it on one that's like 2 years old. Maybe it's not the right tool.
Yeah, I've seen a bunch of Ice Rhino stuff, particularly about some of the complaints that they have about dating. They're using lava, and the lava has impurities in it, and they're dating the impurities and saying, "See, the rock can't possibly be the dating method can't be correct because the impurity didn't come back with the same date as the rest of the rock." Well, yeah, you wouldn't expect it
Yeah.
to.
There's not just like impurities like inherited blastocysts and stuff like that from older eruptions that get carried along, but also every method has error, and so particularly they usually refer to like Mount St. Helens as one of their favorite ones to go back to, and they tested that when it was like 10 years old, and this is like in the 90s, and they used a lab that wasn't cutting edge at the time, and it's kind of analogous to you have like a truck scale, you know, and they sprinkle a pinch of salt on it, and they're like, "Oh, look, it came with like 5 pounds. This is completely unreliable." Well, I mean, you know,
Um, okay, so your journey went from young Earth to old Earth, and what took you from there to away from all theology whatsoever?
so eventually, where I kind of hovered for a while was like deism, like
Okay.
as I was basically looking for something that I required a god to explain, and I wasn't finding anything, and I got pushed further and further back to like maybe some vague creative force, but I was just kind of reluctant to let it go completely.
Mhm.
And I think then I just kind of like put it on the shelf and didn't think about it for a little while. And I think after just kind of marinating in that, it struck me one day that I didn't believe in God. Like it was just
Mm.
gone, you
Mhm.
know?
Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, that was my journey into atheism proper. I've been an atheist ever since.
And how long have you identified as an atheist?
Well, I guess probably some in the neighborhood of 12 years or so.
Oh, okay. So
So
it's
like
been a while.
10 or 12 years, something like that. Like, my wife and I have been together for about that long, and I think I had just deconverted when I met her. So
Okay. Okay. When you deconverted, were there any family issues when you told family members that you no longer believed?
no, mainly because I had just recently gone through a divorce, not that long beforehand, and so being in a very conservative, fundamentalist environment, divorce was not okay, and so that whole issue burned all of the bridges with that entire side of my life. And
Mm,
so by that point, like there was nobody left. Everybody around me didn't care about that anyway. So I imagine had that not happened and I came out as an atheist, I would have had a similar experience. But that ship had already sailed, fortunately or unfortunately.
s
My family, interestingly enough, we didn't like talk about it or collaborate or anything. We just kind of looked around one day and realized we're all atheists. It just kind of
mm,
happened. I don't know. Yeah.
okay, okay. Your parents too?
Yeah. My mom is definitely an atheist now, but she was. I honestly, you know, this sounds bad. I have never asked her about her deconversion. It just never occurred to me until literally this moment
Hmm.
to ask her about it. Maybe I should do that. But yeah, my mom too. Yeah.
Well, that's good to hear. Um, I credit my son with my own deconversion, because I have a somewhat similar journey to you, except I just took a much longer time getting there. Young Earth broke for me when I saw lungfish, because the young Earthers made the horrendous mistake of making a falsifiable claim. And the falsifiable claim was that fish cannot grow lungs. So as soon as I saw a fish with lungs, it was like, So much for young Earth. But then I, like you, went to old Earth, and I was at old Earth for a very long time until my son came to me and said, Mom, Noah's Ark didn't happen. It just can't. And he only gave me one data point to check out, but I checked it out and I saw that he was right. But it was a very small data point. It was that the methane gas from the poop would have killed all the animals. And yeah, he's right. But that wasn't enough to break the whole story for me. What broke the whole story for me was when I heard Aaron Ra say that history proves that not only did could would Noah's Ark it couldn't happen, but that it didn't happen.
Mhm.
And when he said that, I realized he was right because I knew that in no ancient history class that I had ever taken had the professor ever said, okay, and then the civilization all died. And 200 years later, when the nomads from Babylon came wandering in, they re-began the civilization. And it didn't happen. That's not what happened in the history of our world. And so
Mhm.
as soon as he said that, I was like, how could I have not seen that? I have known that all my life, and I just never put it together. And I imagine it's kind of that way for you as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I was just like seem in retrospect so blindingly obvious. For example, on the flood thing, I distinctly recall pointing to flood narratives from other ancient Near Eastern cultures and saying, "Look, like everyone has a story of a flood. Therefore, there was Noah's flood." And it never occurred to me that maybe there's an alternative explanation. Like, I don't know, humans tend to live near water and sometimes water floods, like
Mhm.
maybe they just kind of all had a similar sort of upbringing, like,
Mhm.
but that's, when you're trapped in a bubble and an echo chamber, it not only restricts the things you hear, it restricts like the pathways your mind tends to go.
Mm. Okay. Yeah. Um, so when Young Earth first broke with for you, were you still attending church on a regular basis?
Um, no, like I said, I'd been cut off from my like Christian family at
Mhm.
that point, and I hadn't like I was still wrestling with the fact that from the Christian faith that I was in, I was like living in sin because I was divorced and it was not allowed. I was in an abusive relationship that I was fleeing, but that's not good enough. So I was struggling with the theology of like I am in the wrong and I know that, but there's absolutely no way I'm going back. So like what do I do?
Mhm.
Um, and it
Mhm.
was in the midst. So I think I didn't deconvert because I was in that thing. I was convinced it was right, and I was gonna hold to that belief even if it had bad news for me because I didn't believe it because it was convenient. I believed it because I thought it was right.
Mhm. Mhm.
But having just gone through a big change, I think it kind of primed me to be receptive to new information. Kind of I'd already gone through one change, so another change, the threshold might be a little lower.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
Okay. It probably prompted you to examine the theology a little more carefully as well?
Yeah, I was really restless because I was like a Calvinist. I was the worst kind of Christian. I was the Christian that everybody hates. I was just the worst, and so uh, uh, had I've often wondered like, what if I hadn't been a creationist? What if I had been raised in a more liberal sort of Christian household? Would I still be a Christian? And I can't know. I think it's more likely that I would have been just because the way that the young earth creationist mindset, it's so fragile and brittle that anything can break it. If you learn too much about anything, it'll shatter. And once you've like the floor is broken out from you, it's only, you might just fall all the way down. Right? So,
It's a house of cards.
right. And like you said, um, you know, every single claim is they make the very big mistake of making a ton of falsifiable claims, and they just try not to pay attention when they're falsified. But if you tell your children if this isn't literally true, then the Bible is false, then you're setting them up to learn the Bible's false. That's not a winning
Mhm.
strategy. So
Mhm.
young earth creationism is bad for society because it teaches biblical, or sorry, it teaches just poor thinking and critical thinking skills, but it is also bad for Christianity because it sets a whole generation up for failure.
Yeah, one of the biggest issues that I had, and Ken Ham was not as guilty of this as others were, but the whole distrust for science that his ilk engenders caused a lot of people to distrust the scientists when the pandemic happened.
Mhm.
And yes, the scientists got some things wrong because as we were first discovering this virus, we didn't know how it spread. We didn't know, but we had to trust the process. And that was the important thing. And people like Ken Ham and the Young Earthers were telling us, don't trust the process, don't trust the scientists.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I want to say it was ICR. It might have been CMI, so don't quote me on which one it was. It was one of those two. And I watched a stream they were doing where they were pro-vaccine, right? And they were
Mhm.
trying to tell their followers to go get vaccinated. Here's the science, and they were just shocked that their audience was anti-vax and anti-science. Like, where did this come from? We're like, gee, I don't know. Like,
Oh, I had my brother to come on and analyze a sermon given by John MacArthur. Um, for anyone who doesn't know, MacArthur is the one in California whose church stood up to the mandates against meeting in person, and he won in court and got the permission to meet in person. Unfortunately, living in Los Angeles, it was very hard to measure how much impact his church being open had on the residents of Los Angeles. But he made some very easily falsifiable claims about the vaccine, and it was very obvious that he had no knowledge of what he was talking about as he was claiming things that were untrue about the vaccine. But my brother's a pharmacist, so I brought my brother in to talk about how the vaccine was made and what it is and what it isn't.
yeah, I think so. It was certainly understandable why people would be nervous and things that you don't understand are scary. That I get that, but like you can't be an expert in everything. We have experts for a reason, and you're taught when you're in young Earth creationism that you can't. Part of the reason, uh, true. But, I mean, all models are wise. Some are useful, but you're told that because science is changing, exactly. Science is always changing, therefore you can't rely on it. But what the better way to thinking about it is not that science is changing, because people seem to have this idea that like science is just like whipping back and forth and taking U-turns and just doing random things. That's not how it is at all. Science is getting less wrong over time.
Mhm, mhm.
So, it's Newton was less wrong than Aristotle. Einstein is less wrong than Newton. Einstein's still wrong. There's still more, but whatever comes next will be closer.
And Henry said, but pastors are experts in everything since they speak to God.
Yeah, it's weird how like you think he could have just said like, "Hey guys, boil your water," you know,
Mhm, mhm.
or
Wash your
wash your
hands.
hands. Yeah.
Mhm.
By the way, here's the exact value of pi up to like 100 digits. You'll need it
Yeah.
later.
Um, and Mage says, so what you're saying is the 5G and the vaccines aren't going to turn us into zombies?
So common misconception: the 5G is not in the vaccines; it's actually in the needles. And when the needle hits you, it hits your resonance field and the vibration, because the vaccine lowers your vibration. That's what it does.
Mm, okay.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Getting back to Calvinism, yeah, I think it's interesting that that's where you came from because that's where I came from as well. And I actually reasoned my own way out of it. Was there a particular point of theology that kind of broke the whole thing for you?
Um. No, it kind of my breaking with the faith was more with the scientific evidence, because like part of the reason that I was a Christian was because I believed that was the best explanation for the world I saw. I was
Okay.
woefully ignorant about that world. I was wrong, but that's what I thought. And so I had the same like emotional connection and like intense spiritual experiences, all this sort of other like emotional ties to faith. But the thing that like probably more than anything else undergirded it was my intellectual reasons. So once those were gone, there wasn't like much. I do remember as I was like wrestling with this deconversion process, thinking that I was scared because it was, questioning something fundamental to my person. But I remember thinking that, you know what, I'm just going to follow the evidence, and if the evidence says I'm wrong, then I want to change my mind because I want to be right. But if I am right, then the evidence will just show that. So no problem. I was wrong, as it turns out.
Which leads us directly to the second point that we were going to discuss for the evening, and that is the resurrection. What theologically, or I shouldn't say theologically, but what evidence did you find that convinced you that there was no resurrection?
So
Or was it the lack of evidence for it? Sorry to
it was
interrupt.
it was more the latter. I actually didn't do a very good job of like looking into the resurrection as an event while I was a Christian, or even while I was deconverting. Um, it was just one of those things that I kind of believed miracles happened, and I believed, in these magical explanations, and so it wasn't that big of a leap to think that a guy rose from the dead, and kind of conversely, once I no longer believed that there was a supernatural, well, then didn't happen, it wasn't until I was already an atheist and I was talking to a guy I met online, and he was, we're talking theology, and I don't remember exactly. I said something like not believing the resurrection. He's like, well, have you looked into it? Have you like read? I was like, well, no, I haven't. So I'll go do that, and then I'll come back. So I did, and I'm glad I did, because it's actually really, really interesting. First century Roman history. I've always liked Rome, and so that period being in a Roman province is kind of a natural fit. And what I remember being surprised at how much historical information there was and how much historians could glean from the sources we had, but
Mhm.
uh, obviously it didn't do anything to push me towards faith. It the evidence is pretty clear in the other direction. So, which I don't know. It's interesting, as I know pastors and people who've been to seminary, they get taught the things I learned on my own, but I never heard
Mm.
any of that when I
Mhm.
was in church. Even when I wasn't in like a fundamentalist church, occasionally I went through stints where I went through more liberal churches, and I never heard anything like that either. It was all, Matthew wrote Matthew and Luke wrote Luke, and I get just wasn't. I don't know. Just didn't come up, I guess.
Yeah, I never heard that we don't know who wrote the Gospels until after I deconverted. That was news to me when I deconverted. The biggest thing for me, the biggest shocker for me, was when I heard Pelagius say that 75% of the Gospel of Mark is copied verbatim into Matthew and Luke.
Yeah, the
And
the, the synoptic problem.
yeah, yeah. And if Matthew was written by a disciple, as the fundamentalists claim, why would a witness to the events need to copy from a person who wasn't there?
Yeah,
And
it that was something that just didn't make any. As I looked into it, like even if you even if you try to accept traditional authorship, it doesn't hold up.
Mhm,
If you believe in Markan priority, but even if you even if you don't, there's just too much verbatim agreement. And what some people may forget, I think Mike Lacona, though I don't agree with a lot of what he has to say, I still respect him as a scholar, and he was trying to explain to one of his fellow Christians why, like, we know that these people copied from each other. And he's like, so you have people have the same, they're telling the same story, and not only are they telling it word for word, okay, not only are they telling it word for word decades after it happened, but they're recounting a story that happened in Aramaic, and they're telling it in Greek, and it's still word for word. And that just doesn't happen unless you're
mhm,
like looking at each other's Greek. Like,
mhm,
if you translate anything, even if I don't know any languages, if I did, if I translated something today and then translated the same thing in 5 years, they're not going to be identical, because that's not how languages work.
mhm, mhm. All you have to do is use Google Translate to,
Yeah.
take any Bible verse, put it through Google Translate a couple different times, and you'll find differences.
Yeah, and I think really, the whole push for biblical, like, not just inerrancy, but biblical literalism, does a disservice to the sources themselves because, like, Bart Ehrman is fond of saying, like, assuming like univocality, which means you're assuming everyone is telling the same story, leads you to ignore what Mark was trying to say and what Matthew was trying to say.
Mm.
Like you're ignoring
Mhm.
those authors' own messages, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and so like John changes the date of the resurrection, for example, from the
Mhm.
synoptics. He has it pushed to the right. And so you can do all of these somersaults to try to mash them together, or you can just take John as John. Why did he do that? Well, because he was trying to make a theological point about Jesus being the Lamb of God, and it was important to him. I bet if we went back and asked the author or authors of John why he did that, like why did he lie? He'd say, "I wasn't lying. I was telling the truth. He's the Lamb of God. That's the point." Like so
Mhm.
you're ignoring the intent of the author. And if you go back to things like Genesis, I think it's even worse because you're missing the poetry of the books when you try to force them to be something they're not.
That I'm chuckling at your choice of the word poetry because 2 weeks ago I did a video in response to Todd Friel where he was making an argument for young Earth, and one of his arguments was that Genesis is not poetry. And we know it is not poetry because just listen to it. It does not have the rhyme and meter of poetry. And he read a passage
In
in
English.
English. And I said, someone needs to tell this guy that Genesis was not originally written in English.
And also, like, you know how I know this isn't a poetry? Because this book sucks. Like, what? Yeah, this isn't a poem. It doesn't even rhyme. Like, yeah,
Oh.
crazy.
And even crazier is that later in that same video, he's arguing for why the word day has to be a literal 24-hour day. And it's because the Hebrew word is gnome, and a gnome is a gnome. And I thought, how is it that you understand here that this was written in Hebrew? And 5 minutes ago, you didn't get that this was written
Right.
in Hebrew.
Well, I mean, classic young Earth creationism. Whenever they're confronted with a problem, and I say I did the same thing, of course.
Mhm.
Whenever they're confronted with a problem, they come up with a solution for this solution, usually an ad hoc solution of some sort to this thing, but they never take that and then compare it to other things. They never look at the full implications of the thing they're asserting. This is not necessarily true for some like of the professional young earth creationists, like the Andrew Snellings and stuff. But then
Mhm.
the Andrew Snellings will also just say, "Yeah, it was magic." Like,
Mm.
okay, well, fair
Mhm.
enough, I guess. But
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, God just miracled it. The only problem is that there's certain things that even a miracle cannot explain, like the history.
yeah, I mean, if you're willing to stretch credulity enough, you can explain anything with sufficient divine miracles. If you wanted
Mhm.
to, you can
Mhm.
force it. But like, first of all, is that really reasonable? And secondly, it starts to falsify other claims that you're being made, claims about the nature of the god you claim to be worshiping, because at that point you might as well be worshiping Loki.
Mhm.
Like
The trickster God. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly right.
Mhm. Yeah, like, their claim that all of the fossils in the fossil record were all buried at one time, and you ask them, "Well, why are there layers then to them? Why do you consistently find the same fossils in the same layers throughout the planet?" And the response was, "Well, God made it look that way so that you would think that all right, so why is your God being so deceptive?
Yeah,
Why is your God lying to us?"
yeah, I got you, I fooled you. Okay, get in the lake of fire. Like yeah, it's ridiculous. And
Mm.
sometimes they'll try to come up with other
Oh,
explanations like,
shoot. We've got a bot in the chat.
oh,
Can
nice.
can someone banish the bot? I don't know. We may have to go to making it subscribers only. It's not the first time I've had a bot show up in my site.
There you go. Sign of success.
Okay, getting back to the theology. Let's see. We were talking about young earth.
And biblical literalism and how
Oh,
it
I
misses
know
the
what I
point.
wanted to ask you about. One thing that was brought up to me as an atheist that I never noticed, even though I don't know how many times I read the Gospels. I was a believer for 42 years. I read the Bible from cover to cover many times. I read the New Testament more often than the Old Testaments, and I don't know how many times I read the Gospels, but I never read them trying to put the stories together. I just always assumed that this was one story. And so when it was pointed out to me that, hey, in Luke, Jesus sees the disciples on the road to Emmaus on Resurrection Day, then appears to them later that same day in Jerusalem. But in Matthew, he tells the women, tell the disciples I will meet them in Galilee. Why would he say meet me in Galilee if he's planning to meet them in Jerusalem that same day? And
Mm-hmm.
I've asked a couple theists this question, and I've gotten a few very interesting answers. Had you noticed that issue?
I didn't, and I think that the biggest problem is the way Christians tend to read the Bible, like lay Christians tend to read the Bible, is they read it devotionally. They kind of like, and they read it vertically. If you're going to read the Bible, you just kind of like read it Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, kind of just in order, or whatever. Whereas if you want to find stuff like that, you read it horizontally. You read a story in Matthew, then read the same story in Mark, and read the same story in Luke, and read if it's there in John, and see what the differences are. And that's how you're going to see the differences and see what authors change and maybe for what reason. Usually the answers that I get for those sort of things are like, well, maybe they went to Jerusalem after, but so they like went to Galilee and stayed there, and then later they would like, it doesn't say they didn't stay in Galilee. It's like, come on, like, really, is that how you would tell the story? Like, if what they were trying to communicate was, he said go to Galilee and stay there, and then 100 days later, whatever, go to Jerusalem. Is this how you'd write that story? No, of course not. But it's again tied to the whole idea of biblical inerrancy, which it's clearly not inerrant.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so you end up, I think, getting in this kind of tension. The more the more steps you take, the Bible isn't inerrant, as in without error. So sometimes I'll say, okay, well, maybe it's inerrant and only it's like particulars, but that may not work. But you might say, okay, it has errors, but it's okay because it preserves the most important details. But then, like, how far do you go? How many errors is too many errors?
Mhm. I think if you take and look at it as a piece of historical literature, it has value.
Sure.
But if you take it and look at it as the word of God, that's when it falls apart.
Yeah, and that's actually one thing that I would push back on many of my fellow atheists who want to take this book and just chuck it in the bin and like, oh, it's completely worthless. Well, it's not completely worthless. It was written in history by Christians in the first century, mostly, maybe John, possibly early second century, but probably first. And if nothing else, it was a book written by believers at the time. So it can tell us what they believed about their religion early in its conception. That has value.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
we don't have to, the two settings are not Jesus rose from the dead and split, made water into wine and stuff, or it's complete nonsense. Like there's some subtle middle ground we can take there. It's okay.
Mhm. Mhm. I met someone quite recently who took a different tact on inerrancy than I've ever heard before, and it is a more reasonable position, although I haven't talked to him enough to really figure out how it works, and that is his position is not that the words on the page are inerrant, but the intents of the author were inerrant. And my question to him was, all right, but we don't even know who these people are. How can we determine that they had inerrant intent when we don't even know what those intentions are?
But okay, who doesn't have an errant intent? I've never written something and intended to make a mistake. I always have an errant intent. Like, I wrote this thing. It's full of typos. Yeah, but my intent wasn't errant, so that's even worse than the usual. The autographs, the original writings were without error, because like, okay, we don't have those, so it doesn't do us any good. But like, at least then it's like a writing. Like, that's super weak sauce. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, I mentioned that to him too, is that I'd never heard anyone take that position, and he was surprised. He said, "Oh, really? That's the one that I've always heard preached," which I thought was kind of weird.
I don't know. I think probably the most resilient form of inerrancy, if you're going to preserve it, would be something like what Lacona describes, where he's like, well, it preserves the gist. Like,
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
gist of the story being that Jesus preached a message, and here's the kind of basics of the message, and he died for our sins and rose again. Like, it all preserves that gist. Like, okay, but like, maybe. But then, like, why are we using this word inerrancy then?
Mhm.
Because it's definitely
Mhm.
not inerrant, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
but
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I was quite surprised when I watched the debate between Mike Licona and Bart Ehrman. And in that debate, Mike Licona said that the zombies of Matthew and the temple veil ripping were portents.
Mhm.
Now, I had heard Mike Licona take the position that the zombies were portents before, but not the temple veil. And I was really surprised at the temple veil only because as a believer, whenever people told the resurrection story, they always kind of glossed over the zombies. Nobody ever made a big deal of the zombies, probably because they were so problematic and you didn't really kind of
Yeah.
want to admit they were there. But I've heard a number of pastors do entire sermons on the ripping of the temple veil and how important this was and how this was such a symbolic gesture on God's part to tear open this veil and announce to the world that you can now pray directly to me. There is no barrier between us. And to have Mike Lacona say, "No, that didn't happen." That
Well,
was eye-opening to me.
see, God intended to tear the veil. His intent was veil tearing, but
Uh,
yeah, I that is funny. I don't remember. I mean, I'm sure kind of is one of those things I knew, but I cannot tell you that I ever heard a sermon where they like emphasized the fact that we had, dead saints parade in Jerusalem. You know,
right.
uh,
A Dead Saints Parade, the only one person in all of Jerusalem during the Passover when Jerusalem was extremely crowded, only one person managed to notice it.
well, I mean, that nobody else said there wasn't a zombie parade, so yeah, it's like the whole, like, how many people were at the tomb? Was
Mhm.
it one person? Was it two people? Was it an angel? Well, like, maybe it was, like, three angels, but the other ones didn't mention all the other angels, like, yeah.
One that Josh Bowen pointed out, that's interesting is it's in the Old Testament. It's in is it Genesis or Exodus? Let's see. Um, it's in Genesis when Joseph is sold into slavery. That's why I wasn't sure if it was in Exodus. Um, and if you read the story, Joseph is sold to the Ishmaelites and he's sold to the Midianites. And the Midianites sell him to the Egyptians, and the Ishmaelites sell him to Potiphar. And he said, try to ask a believer how that works. How did he go back and forth between his brother and the Ishmaelites and the Midianites? And I had one believer say, well, no problem. The Ishmaelites and the Midianites are the same people. They're just repeating the story. But the real answer is that the editor took two different
Mhm.
versions of the same story and meshed them together. And instead of editing it in a way that the story would flow, he just put it all together.
Which happened all the time in
Mhm,
Genesis. Yeah.
mhm. Had you noticed that discrepancy?
just like all of these other things as a Christian, none of these ever took any root on my brain. And I don't think I ever like sat down and read the book cover to cover, but my eyes have touched most of it at least. There's probably a bunch of the begats that I haven't quite read all of them, but but yeah, like these things it just never occurred to me. I guess because it was just the idea that it could be wrong was so foreign to me that
Mhm, mhm,
it
mhm.
I never could. If it's impossible for it to be mistaken, then you're not going to see any mistakes. You know. Yeah, yeah. I think like we could do a Passion of the Christ, but like just like taking the books as they are. That might be a good movie.
I don't know what you're gonna do with the traveling back and forth. I did have one believer suggest a way to make both stories work. But then when I put it down step by step of what would have to happen, he then had to admit that no, that couldn't happen because his version was, well, Jesus met the disciples in Galilee and then met them on the road to Emmaus later that same day. I said, okay, it's an 80-mile journey to Galilee. They went fishing and had breakfast with Jesus in Galilee. So, in order for that to be true, after the women came and told the disciples that Jesus would meet them in Galilee, they walked 80 miles an hour to get to Galilee, had breakfast with Jesus, walked 80 miles an hour back to Jerusalem so that they could meet him on the road to Emmaus later that same day.
Well, through Christ, all things are possible.
Right, of course.
Yeah. So I think like it's obvious that the literalist kind of position where these stories are exactly true as they were written is completely untenable. I think the position where you allow more to be allegory or just kind of getting the message, or maybe
Mhm,
they were just wrong. Like
mhm.
one of my favorite stories from Bart Ehrman when he was like still a Christian and still coming up. He like was I think the paper was on the governor of Syria. How was it's written as Quirinius, but it was supposed to be some other guy. I think maybe it was some other. It was one thing where the book said it was person A, but we know it's person B. How do you reconcile that? And he wrote this like huge paper, like trying to like wrestle the two together. And he got an A on the paper, but his advisor was like, or maybe Mark was just wrong. And he was like, wow, that's a way better explanation. Yeah.
Uh, since you are into Roman history, I'm sure you've probably looked at the Quirinius problem.
I mean, it's only a problem if you force if it can't have
Literalism.
error, right? It's
Mhm,
only a problem if you force literalism.
mhm.
Otherwise, all it is I mean, the guy was writing what 50 years afterwards, maybe depending on what book you're talking about. Mark, late 60s, early 70s. John in the 90s. Like they got some details wrong. They messed up the years a little bit.
Right,
That's
right,
all that's all it
exactly.
is.
Mhm,
You don't need to dig any further than that. They just made a mistake. No big deal.
right,
Um,
and the problem is that then you have to let go of inerrancy.
yeah,
For me, though, when I let go of inerrancy, the whole house of cards collapsed because it was all built that was the foundation of my faith, was inerrancy. Um, and I was well aware of that because whenever I went through major trials in life, my fallback was always, well, I know God is good, and I know that because of inerrancy. And, inerrancy was the rock upon which I built it all. So when inerrancy failed, everything else failed with it.
yeah. Uh, I see someone in the chat's asking this problem that we're talking about, the Granius problem. So I'm citing off the top of my head. So uh, check up on me to make sure I'm not getting the details wrong. But as I recall, it has to do with the census in Luke. Um,
Mhm.
and so both Matthew and Luke need to get Jesus to be in Bethlehem, even though everyone knew he was from Galilee. And they do it in different ways. The way that Luke does it is by having the Romans do this extremely elaborate and unrealistic census where everybody has to go like back to their ancestral home
Ancestral
from
home.
1,000 years ago, which is just ridiculous, but it doesn't matter. That's how he does it. And he says in Luke at the beginning of chapter 2, it came about in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census would be taken over all of the inhabited earth, so the empire. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was the governor of Syria. And so it says this is when it was. Unfortunately, from other things that are in Luke's and Matthew's story, we know that the kind of timeline it would be, and Quirinius wasn't the governor then. He wasn't the governor. He was at one point a governor of Syria, but he wasn't at that moment. I think the thing is Herod's reign, because we know when
Yes,
Herod died.
because Herod died in 4 BCE, and Quirinius did not become governor of Syria until 6 CE, 10 years later.
Right. And
And
so you
one,
can't have both of those people simultaneously in Syria at the same time.
right. But there's a further complication that I did not realize until I read Richard Carrier, Dr. Richard Carrier's book, or his essay, uh, Homer, Hitler, Bible, Christ.
Mhm.
And in the essay on Jesus' birth, he points out that Judah was not a Roman province until 6 CE. Judah was annexed. Until then, it was an allied kingdom. And in 6 CE, Judah was annexed into Syria, and Quirinius was appointed the governor. And that's why the census was taken at that time, because Judah was a brand new province. They did not have any tax rolls. So they did a census to start the tax rolls so that Rome could tax this new province.
Mhm.
Rome had no authority to tax Judah prior to 6 CE.
Yeah, they wouldn't have taxed it directly. Rome
They could have
ruled.
taken tribute from them
Yeah,
before that.
yeah. Rome, as they did so often with many other lands, they had a client king, and they were in charge, but not directly. They were subcontracting out their authorities.
Right. They had a
Yeah,
puppet king. Yeah, yeah.
right.
But they didn't have the authority to directly tax the citizens.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems with that. And again, it's easily solved if you just allow that there was a mistake.
Hmm.
It was a
Hmm.
mistake motivated by Luke's desire to get Jesus to Bethlehem through whatever means necessary. And so,
Well, Matthew's method is much better. He just has them living there to begin with.
yeah, exactly. Like that makes a lot more sense
Hmm.
that they're there, they have to flee. You can even tie in some nice allegory with the Exodus and that whole thing. Like, it's much more symbolic. I think Luke's gospel in general is better than Matthew's, but Matthew's solution there is way smoother. Of course, it does have the minor issue of then having Herod kill all of these like hundreds of toddlers, and nobody mentioned that or thought it was a problem at all.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
That's another one where if you read the two stories side by side, they don't work.
Yeah. Not only do
Because,
they not work, they match in almost nothing. They
yeah, yeah. Because in order for them both to work, you would have Mary and Joseph going from Nazareth, from Nazareth to Bethlehem, and then on the eighth day they go to Jerusalem to dedicate the child, but then they go back to Bethlehem.
Mhm.
Why? Why would they go back to Bethlehem? That makes no
Yeah.
sense.
If they
And
actually lived in Galilee, yeah.
right, and then when they want to flee Herod, why would they go to Egypt if they live in Nazareth and Herod is not king over Nazareth? Why not go home?
Right. And then when they come back in Matthew, they come back from Egypt and they
Mhm.
try to go back to Bethlehem.
Right, right.
Well, if they're from Nazareth, why would they try to go back to Bethlehem?
Bethlehem, right.
Yeah, the nativity that we all grew up seeing is just like a mash of the two. But then when you do that, you're no longer telling the story of the Bible. Now you've made your own fifth gospel, the gospel of whomever. Uh, you know,
Mhm, mhm,
Another thing that I never was exposed to before I became an atheist was the apocryphal gospels, which I think are some of the
mhm.
most interesting writings, like the infancy narrative of Thomas,
Mhm.
and having Jesus as just like a terrible kid, just Just like,
Is that the one where he makes the doves?
yeah,
Okay.
he's fashioning clay doves on the Sabbath, which of course you're not allowed to do. And when someone goes tells on him, Joseph runs over and chastises him, and he like claps his hand, and the doves fly away. A kid like muddies his puddle, and he strikes the kid. I think that one he makes him old, like robs him of his youth. Another kid like bumps into him, and he kills him on the spot. He's yeah, it's written
I
like
saw
interesting Jesus fan fiction.
I saw a movie that was also kind of it was loosely based on the Bible, but definitely not, completely following the Bible story. And they have Mary telling Jesus some bedtime stories, and some of the parables that Jesus tells later in
Mm,
life are things that he heard from his mother as bedtime stories as a child.
that's very neat. Yeah.
Mhm.
Talking about history, it was funny. I recently went to Rome for our honeymoon. Uh, yeah, yeah. Where would you go? Like, where would I? I guess I'd have to go to India. Like, uh,
I would have to send part of me to Ireland and part of me to Germany.
maybe pay taxes at both spots. I don't know.
Yeah.
Uh, but I was in Rome recently, and it was awesome seeing like all these pieces of history that I'd been fascinated with as a kid, and like standing next to the Arch of Constantine and stuff. Uh, the only detraction really was on the way back from one of the catacombs outside the city. The tour guide decided to fill time by talking about the Council of Nicaea, and boy, did they mess that up. It was like,
Oh, this sounds interesting.
yeah, it was like every myth you've ever heard about the Council of Nicaea, just one right after the other. It was, Constantine didn't really convert. It was a political move, and he convened the council to declare Jesus God, and that's where they decided what books were in the Bible. And also they talked about how he handed the Western Roman Empire to the Pope, which also didn't happen. It was just like one right after another. It was pretty rough. I was like vibrating in my seat. My wife was like, "Don't say anything." It's like, but she's wrong. Yeah, we have a video on the Council of Nicaea as well. If there was like one thing I could change about, the way that New Testament history is talked about, it would be that.
So, what did happen at the Council of Nicaea?
So that's a great question. So the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea was convened. They tried to answer a lot of questions. So a lot of things happened there. But the primary thing they were talking about was the Arian controversy. And this was a conflict over how to understand that Jesus was God. So something that a lot of atheists get wrong. Uh, oh, nice. That's more than me for sure. I'm from Newfoundland and India mostly. Um, yes, yeah. Fortunately, I was in the back of the bus, so I wasn't able to like charge frontward to make a scene. But um, I did write a scathing review on TripAdvisor. But so they were talking about the Arian controversy, and so the controversy was over how to understand Jesus as God. So something that people get wrong is that this is where Jesus was declared to be God, which is not true. Everyone there believed Jesus was God, but what does that mean? And so the view that ended up winning out is the canonical view, the Trinitarian view, where Jesus and God are co-equal. But the view that Irenaeus, who was a bishop of Alexandria, I think, his view was that Jesus was God, he was divine, but he was not co-equal with God the Father. He was subordinate, more like the polytheistic religions of Rome. He was a God, but he was not the same as God the Father. And it was a big deal. It was a huge controversy, and it was tearing the church apart. And Constantine called the council in part to solve this problem. He didn't care so much what they picked; just pick something so that we'll all get along. And it ended up they picked the view that's Orthodox today, and that's where the Nicene Creed came about. Saying God the Father and the Son are equal, yada yada. They tried to explain a bunch of other things. Other things they didn't explain. They didn't pick the date of Christmas. Also, not the Council of Nicaea. They did try to set a date for Easter. They didn't. So that's also not the Council of Nicaea. But but there's a good chance if someone tells you something happened at the Council of Nicaea, they're wrong. If they don't mention the Arian controversy, they probably don't know what they're talking about.
That is one of the things that I heard as a believer that I bought because I didn't know otherwise, was that the early church was in complete agreement with one another.
Mm.
That they all believed the same things about Jesus, and they all, used the same scriptures, and that's why when the council met that determined the canon, it really was more or less just a rubber stamp or a blessing of what they were already doing, because this is just what they were already doing.
And in fact, not only were the original Christians not harmonious, but I mean, it's wild if you go back and look at like very early Christian heresies, some of the stuff that they came up with. And it's not just wild from like the variety and diversity of early Christian thought. Things like the Docetists and Gnostics aren't kind of, some sects are tied to Christianity. That's pretty interesting, but also a lot of things that I heard at church are heresies. Like one of the ways the Trinity, yeah, one of the ways the Trinity was explained to me as a Christian was, well, it's kind of like how you are a father to your son and a brother to your brother, and like, and that is a heresy from like the 2nd century. So it's interesting. I think a lot of Christians today would find themselves in hot water if they were spreading their beliefs there. Though I will say the whole like doing the canon as like recognizing what people are already doing is not inaccurate to the way the canon came about.
Mhm, mhm.
It's kind of like it was almost like crowdsourced. It was kind of like what the ones that kind of bubbled to the top that had apostolic, or they believed anyway, had apostolic connections. It had to be old, it had to be accepted, had to have apostolic connections in order to be accepted as canon. Um,
Let's see. Oh, one of the things that always bugged me when I was a believer is whenever I would ask about the canon, I was pushed aside. I could not find a pastor that would answer the question, "How did we get the canon?" I was either, we'll talk about that later. Why don't you go read a book on church history? But I could not get a straight answer to that question.
which is it's I mean, that's definitely intentional because we know, like,
Mhm.
it's not, this isn't one of those things that's, like, lost to the sands of history. It's like, we have a pretty good idea of how the canon came about, and honestly, it's not something that they necessarily need to even hide, Uh
Mhm.
because the gospels that we have, for instance, are pretty early. I mean, probably some of the earliest that were written, and so like you could tout that, like that, like you don't need to hide from it all. At least you've got that. Of course, then you might be getting into things they don't want to talk about, like the fact that a lot of them are pseudepigrapha or forgeries, um,
Mhm. Mhm.
as we'd call them today. Uh, I actually, one of my favorite, I forget which book it is, but one of my favorite examples of forged book in the New Testament is it's a book where they actually, in the book, they talk about how bad it is to forge like things in other people's names.
Mhm.
Yeah, I forget which book it is, but
I really think, though, that a big part of the reason that I was shuffled was because I am female. If I had been male and had asked the same question, I think I would have gotten a much more serious answer.
yeah, well, you don't need to worry your pretty little head with that kind of stuff,
Exactly.
with the men in
Exactly.
authority. Um, yeah, we're actually, I'm doing a Bible study on student Dr. Ben's channel. First one's tomorrow, and we're going through.
I'm in
Oh,
that group
you're in it
too.
too. Yeah, yeah. Okay, there we
Mhm.
go. Good plug. We're both going to be there talking about what's the name of that book? It's like True Women 101. Yeah,
Mhm. Mhm.
yeah. I don't want to get into that so we don't spill the tea for tomorrow, but yeah,
Are you on tomorrow's panel?
yeah. I'll be there tomorrow.
Okay. I was not told one way or another, so I assume I am not, but,
I don't know. I can
I
ask
don't know.
Ben, but
If he sends me a link, I'll be there, and if he doesn't send me a link, I won't.
yeah.
Mm. Um, What other talking points are your favorite talking points about?
I think when I'm talking about this with Christians, some of my favorite talking points are the minimal facts arguments is one I hear all the
Mm,
time. Um, the you know things like that there was definitely a tomb, which there's basically no reason. Well, not no reason. It is
mhm,
recorded in all the Gospels, so it is multiply attested. You've got that.
mhm,
But I'll hear things like. Um, Joseph of Arimathea is definitely real because why would they possibly have made it up? There's no reason. I'm like, you can't think of any reason why they would have made up a respected member of the community who is part of the Sanhedrin who is secretly a follower of Christ. No reason at all. Nothing comes like, come on, it's like a crippling lack of imagination. you know? Uh, yeah. So that's one I get all the time. The This has become more popular recently, but talking about the burial in a tomb versus the more typical way that uh, crucified victims were treated, which was to be hanged on the cross and then either just devoured by animals or thrown in a common grave.
mhm,
Um,
mhm, mhm,
we'll often hear that, well, Jewish practice, as recorded in Josephus, was, and also in the Bible, they are not supposed to keep people up in the tree, and it's important. And it's like, yeah, that would be super important if the Jews had crucified him, but the Jews weren't in charge, like, and I don't know if you've heard about this guy Pilate, but he wasn't exactly the kindest fellow. He
mhm.
he made a career of himself. In fact, he got fired because he was too brutal for the Romans, and that is saying something, you know. Uh,
Yeah, was it Augustus? I forget who was Caesar at the time. Uh, was upset with him for ticking off the Jews too much.
Yeah, he was rocking the boat too much even for Caesar, and
Right,
the
right.
the which I mean the bar is pretty low for like Roman rule. Basically, as long as the tribute is still coming and people aren't in armed revolt, it's fine. But yeah, that was he was eventually fired for that reason. But yeah, so they're like, why would this guy who is recorded in the two places he's talked about in Josephus and he's talked about in Philo of Alexandria, and both of them, that granted they are sources with their own biases and reasons for saying what they're saying, but they are both unified on how brutal Pilate was. So why would this person have granted a special exception for Jesus, this no-name carpenter Jewish guy, because the Jews, like, why?
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to my point that I didn't quite finish. I sidetracked myself on the temple veil. Is when it was preached to me as being such an important thing, one thing I never noticed was the fact that no Jewish historian ever mentioned it.
Mhm.
And this would have been extremely important to them had this actually happened. I can't imagine Josephus not writing about it.
Yeah, it would have been like all of the events surrounding Christ's return would have been extremely important, but particularly that one, breaching of the Holy of Holies.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, that's, I think that touches on a problem I have with the way that Christianity is taught in churches. Like, it's Jewish thought is almost completely disregarded. And there's almost this idea that's like, how dense do the Jews need to be to not see how obvious this is? Like, look at Isaiah 53. It's so obvious, right? Um, and yet, at no time were we ever taught or engaged at all with the millennia of Jewish scholarship on their holy book. Like, they might be good people to ask, like, what the Torah said, but,
Mhm.
evidently not.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. Which the Isaiah 53 thing, that's one of the prophecies that is often thrown at me by Christians, which it to their credit, if you only read little bits of it, it sounds really good, right? Like,
Mhm.
looking back, he was pierced for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. It's just talking about the suffering servant. It sounds great until it like literally tells you who the servant is. It's Israel, so case closed. But
Mhm.
Yeah.
I always found Psalm 22 to be compelling. You know, the description of, my bones were not broken, but,
You can count my bones, I
yeah, you
believe.
could
They're
count my
casting
bones, but
lots.
none of them were broken. They cast lots for my clothing. Yeah, and
Right.
that, yeah,
Which yeah, and they'll point to ones like that or Isaiah 53 and like, look at the gospels. Look, they're casting lots. It's like, yeah, the guys writing the gospels had that in their hands while they were writing it, you know? Like
mhm,
these were Jews that were writing up like well, Matthew was probably Jewish. By the time Mark and Luke, they may have actually not been Jewish. They may have been pagan by that point. But regardless, the original Christians were Jewish, right? And so like they certainly had access to the Jewish Bible, you know, or the Torah, not the Bible. They didn't call it the Bible.
mhm,
But yeah.
mhm. Which another point is that there is no such thing as a Jewish young earther. If Genesis is supposed to be interpreted literally, that, these are 24-hour days and the earth is only 6,000 years old, we should have Jewish young earthers.
Well, the Jews don't know how to interpret their text. I mean, look, they missed all these prophecies. Now, I think not all sects Judaism is not a monolithic thing either,
Correct.
but
Mhm.
I there's definitely a lot more of a lax feel in some sects of Judaism. I have a good friend of mine who's Jewish, and he says not only is he an atheist, he said he's pretty sure his rabbi's an atheist. Like he's like in his sect of Judaism, the what question of whether or not God exists doesn't really matter. Like nobody cares,
Mhm.
which seems weird to me, but it's just like it's not about that. It's about the culture and the tradition, and that's what it's about. So
Tradition.
yeah. Um, I see a question there in the chat by Johnny Rapine. Yeah.
Is
So,
this why Paul focused on the Gentiles? The rabbis were contradicting everything Christianity claimed regarding the Old Testament.
yeah, I think kind of. So I'm of the opinion that Paul is more important to Christianity than Jesus
Oh,
is.
yeah. Yeah.
Without Paul, you don't get Christianity. If you didn't have
Mhm.
Paul, then Christianity would be another sect of Messianic Judaism, just like other sects of apocalyptic Messianic Judaism in the first century that historians would care about, and nobody else would care about. But because Paul was the innovator, and he, yeah, if you just read the Bible in a kid's class, you'd be kicked out. But Paul saw himself as the missionary to the Gentiles. Like that was his mission, right? And it's not even so much that the rabbis were contradicting everything that the Christians said. Honestly, I don't think the rabbis really cared much because Christians were a very small sect at the time, right? But
Mhm.
there was the story of Jesus, while it does stem from Jewish tradition, obviously, and it can spring from these apocalyptic anticipations of the end of the world that's coming very soon and a future resurrection of the dead, there's also a lot of stumbling blocks because the Messiah is not supposed to lose. He's supposed to be a great conquering hero or maybe an amazing priest, but definitely not get killed at the hands of his enemies. That
Mhm.
is completely foreign to the entire concept of Judaism. And so trying to convince Jews of this was very difficult. But Gentiles don't have that stumbling block. For them, for the pagans, it was completely common for a very wise, powerful man to ascend into godhood. That happened all the time. So it was no big deal. Like that was a much lower entry bar. And so his taking it upon himself to be the missionary. Also, it helped that he was not from Jerusalem, I imagine, because he was, living around pagans more often, probably. That's just my own personal guess. But that innovation, that and the core innovation of Christianity being exclusivity, unlike every other religion except Judaism, but they weren't really proselytizing. If someone became a Christian, they stopped being pagan. That was not true of any other religion. You could pick up a new god anytime you wanted. Nobody cared as long as you kept making sacrifice appropriately. But yeah, every time a Christian became Christian, they stopped being pagan, and that's why paganism lost.
It
Yeah,
also kind of helps that Christianity became the state religion, and
it
you kind of didn't have a choice after a certain point.
Yeah, though I don't think that has the impact that it would seem at first, because so by the time Constantine, which he did not make Christianity the state religion, that was Theophilus, I believe his name was, which was the 2 emperors later. But Constantine did convert, and he so the emperor is Christian. That's where the power is, right? But
Right.
by that time, Christianity was probably about 5% of the empire, which doesn't seem like much. But because Christianity grows exponentially, whereas paganism doesn't, because again, paganism isn't converting any Christians, or not many, right? They're not proselytizing in the same way, and so every time a Christian gets a convert, they're stealing it from paganism, and then they're producing their own through population. And so if you just do the math, like of the population spread from Constantine early, you can make an exponential growth curve. And even had Constantine not converted, I think a Roman emperor very shortly thereafter would have, because Christianity was on the rise. It was destined to spike in the way it ended up spiking. But Constantine certainly helped. I think it's a little bit off topic, but the next emperor is actually super interesting. He was his name. He's known as the Julian the Apostate. He's super interesting because so Constantine was a Christian, and the Edict of Milan made religious freedom a thing in the Roman Empire. It stopped all the persecutions of the Christians, which had been happening right before Constantine, not so much before, but it was a little bit. So it stopped all that. Julian was raised Christian, but reconverted to paganism. That's interesting for a few reasons. First of all, because he thought there was a thing to convert to, which was like a new concept in and of itself, because paganism wasn't like a cohesive thing. But he decided he wanted to go back to the old ways, and he had some really good ideas. Like, he made it so that the only people who could teach the classics were pagans, because they were pagan writings. So how could a Christian teach pagan writings? Which sounds innocuous until you remember that's how education was done. You learned by reading the classics, right? That was
Mm.
like a core part of education. And so if the only people who can teach it are pagans, then all of the teachers teaching the nobles are going to be pagan. And so he was setting up a whole new generation of pagan nobles, which he hoped probably would roll back the tide. Unfortunately, he ruled for, I think, 3 years. So we'll never know what would have happened had he had more time to enact his reforms. But then the next emperor after him was hard in the paint for Christianity. He's the one who made it the official religion, and history goes from there.
We'd all be worshiping Zeus.
Maybe. I think just this is all conjecture with absolutely no evidence behind it, but I think paganism was doomed to fail unless they innovated, because
Mhm.
again, Christianity is proselytizing, and they are stealing worshipers. And so paganism would have had to have reformed in some way, probably by becoming more exclusive, just like Christianity did, if they wanted to survive. But that's just my guesses.
Which is where I see Christianity heading at the moment. I see it in its downfall because it refuses to change. And, yes, there are some churches that are willing to change with the times, and there are some churches that are willing. And the biggest issue, of course, is the LGBTQ community. And those churches that do embrace that community, I think, can survive. And those that refuse to, I think, are eventually doomed to failure as more and more people realize that these are our family and our friends, and we're not going to take the stance that they're doomed to hell just for being who they are.
Yeah, I agree. They're not going to win the culture war.
Mhm.
You just need to look at the next generation to see how the deck is stacked against them. In that sense, I don't think religion's going away.
Mhm.
Humans are too inclined to believe in magical things for the concept of religion to go away, but it's definitely going to adapt. I think fast forward 100 years, I expect that what kind of, I mean, like, if you look at even conservative Christianity today and go back 500 years, they would have been like, loose liberal, same thing will be true in the future. If you look, progressive Christianity now will probably be mainstream Christianity in the future, I expect.
One thing that I took away from my trip to Italy was just how ingrained um, religion is into the culture there. There is so much really, absolutely fantastic artwork. Some of the greatest masterpieces of the world, some of the greatest artistic masterpieces ever made are religious based. They have religious themes to them. And the same is true of music. Some of the greatest music ever written is also religious themed. And for that reason, I think that religion is just woven into the fabric of who we are.
Yeah, and I think it will never completely leave that behind it, and I don't think we should. If you look at, the Sistine Chapel is a religious building, but it is amazing. Why
Mhm.
would we want to jettison this history? We can take the good and leave the bad. We don't need. I don't think it is necessarily the case that just because something touched religion one time, it is therefore tainted for all eternity. Like for instance, I still celebrate Christmas, and so I put up a tree and I sing Christmas carols, and I'm not talking any like namby-pamby, like weak Christmas carols. I'm talking like come.
I saw mommy kissing Santa Claus.
Yeah, I mean that's fine, but I want like God rest ye merry gentlemen, come all ye faithful. Like I love the tradition of Christmas carols and that sort of thing. And I think honestly that's probably the direction things are going. It's like it'll be almost like my friend's Judaism, where it's about the tradition and the community and the stories that we tell, but less about, casting people into a lake of hellfire. At least I hope. At least I hope that's where it's going. I think Christianity would do a lot less harm to the world if that's the form it took.
Mhm, mhm. It would also be so much less absurd. Yeah, the idea of claiming that a person loves you, but will cast you into eternal torture
Hmm.
for something that he knew you were going to do even before he ever made you, and yet he chose to make you knowing that that's how you're going to turn out.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems with the eternal conscious torment thing, but honestly, for me, the thing that resonates most with me with the problem of hell is not even like the contradictions with God's nature, which are definitely real. But
Mhm,
for me, it's the issue with people in heaven. So, like for instance, my grandmother was extremely religious until the day she died, um, and allegedly, what they want to tell me is that my grandmother is going to be happy, joyful, uh, in heaven and for all eternity, while she knows I, her beloved grandson, is roasting in a lake of fire. No, that's not my grandmother. Then, like, there's no way my grandmother could be happy in that way. And so, either God has replaced my grandmother with some weird automaton, or it's wrong. You know.
mhm, mhm, mhm. And with that, we are running out of time. And so I am going to give you one more chance to plug your channel because there's a lot of people here now that were not here at the beginning. And if there are any closing comments that you wish to make, go ahead.
Sure. So my channel, like you can see the name there, is Reason to Doubt. If you look for it and you find an awesome hip hop group, we're not them. Keep going. We're the next channel over. But we focus on skepticism. So we want to believe things with good evidence and to really examine our assumptions and our beliefs to make sure that they're correct. And we're all about changing our minds if we find new evidence. So we focus not just on atheist content, but also on skeptical content. So like things coming up in the near future. We are tackling one of those who doesn't love a list video. We're tackling one of those top 10 questions for atheist videos. After coming up later, we're hitting like Halloween ghost stories and talking about the supernatural because of Halloween. And looking a little bit further into the future, I've got David Fitzgerald coming on, who's a mythicist author. So we're going to be talking about mythicism with him. And yeah, so we try to get a mix of general skepticism and also religious questions because our philosophy is that, well, we are atheist and we think that's the correct conclusion. Being a skeptic and being religious are not mutually exclusive. You could be a religious skeptic if you honestly believe that's where the evidence was leading you. So I think skepticism is for everybody.
Okay, very good, very good. Thank you very much. And what I have coming up is my scripted video this week is on Herschel Walker. I think not enough attention is being paid to how horrendous the policies are that he is wanting to implement in this country. Um, and next week, I do not yet have a guest lined up. I'm trying to put together a program on problems with the transgender community in that when they die, that their families want to bury them under their dead names rather than the names that they have chosen for themselves, and how to handle this issue. Um, Part of the reason I don't have a panel yet together for that is I want Phoebe Rose on the panel, and this is an ungodly hour for Phoebe. It's like 2, 3 in the morning right now for Phoebe. So we may end up doing that one on a weekend rather than at my regular time, but I'm still working out the time on that with Phoebe. So either that show will be next week or next week will probably just be another community building. And I've got a couple other guests I'm trying to line up, but it sometimes takes a while depending on who I'm reaching out to.
Very important topic. Totally
Mhm.
agreed.
Okay, so with that, thank you very much for coming, Jordan, and thank you to everyone in the chat for your wonderful questions and comments, and thank you so much, Nadimas, for the super chat. Live your life.